And then we explore those soulmate connections, and we explore these concepts of karma and, love and hate being two sides of the same coin.
Cool.
And then, there's always the question, is this all sort of a figment of this guy's imagination where he's traveling in time in his mind, or is this actually something that happened?
It's very brightly colored and it's very loud and it's fun for a while.
We want to be free to do what we want to do.
Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barker, the president of the Hells Angels.
This is 1095.
Hey, Henry, how you doing? Good morning.
I'm excellent. Matt, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. And glad we got it sorted. We had a couple of times there where my fault. I think we misaligned, but good that we're finally jumping on. And like you're one in a series of people I've now interviewed actually through this platform, which is interesting, of linking up, podcast guests with hosts. And I've had a few authors on recently. I know we're going to talk a little bit about your connection to books, not necessarily to writing. Also, we'll talk about TV and also entrepreneurship, all I think which are things that fit in your kind of area. But maybe before I do you a disservice, do you want to just give us, a bit of background on yourself, where you are as well, and what you're about, and we'll jump into some stuff.
Absolutely. Wow. At this age, there's a lot to talk about, but let's start with where I am. I'm in South Florida. That's why it's hot and humid out here. And I really consider myself, more than anything, a hedonistic and opportunistic entrepreneur, meaning I'm really following things that I like to do that make me happy and take advantage of opportunities if and when they present themselves.
That sounds well. Let's talk about some. I mean, you've done stuff in the tech space, right? I saw the SAAS acronym on your profile, and that's somewhere I spent at least 18 years of my career, both in established businesses and in my own startups. But yeah, just for anyone listening, because I don't normally use acronyms like that on this podcast, but software as a service. So for anyone who doesn't know what SaaS is, the software tech side that we've seen balloon in the last, I would say, 20 years, really. I mean, it's now everything we use is cloud, is SaaS. And yeah, talk to us a bit about what you've done in that space. I think some stuff recently as much as a while ago, right?
Yep. Yeah. At the end of the day, yeah. I mean, this was the opportunistic part because I couldn't write a line of code if you put a gun to my head. To be honest with you, I don't know technology, but there I was, I saw this new 360-degree virtual tour, and I thought, that's the coolest thing ever. You can put a CD-ROM in a computer and look all around and up and down, and wow, this is what I want to do, right? So I start producing these 360 virtual tours for destinations and hotels. This is mid-90s, right?
Wow, that's okay.
And so
way ahead of its time.
I'm old. Yeah, I'm old. I was one of the first. I bought the world's second produced one-shot 360-degree camera. So anyway, I'm going along, and the hotels will say, so how do we put this stuff, these virtual tours, on this new World Wide Web thingy? And I'm like, I don't know. Send them a CD-ROM, right? That's what I was giving them. And they say, yeah, there are no standards, right? And I'm like, all right, let me see what I can do to help. This is where the opportunity comes in. So I'm thinking, okay, how do I put these things, host these virtual tours with these applets that are required to play it, and distribute it to the various travel sites? And so while I'm doing that, I'm thinking, okay, so there's a better opportunity here than having a race to the bottom because any kid with a computer and a camera is a competitor in producing the virtual tours. All right, let's distribute them. And eventually I realized that it's not just the nice to have, which are virtual tours, but the need to have, which are photos. Because early on, those systems, the rate and availability, didn't have pictures. You would go to a brick and mortar travel agency on the corner and they had this cryptic green screen. There were no pictures, right? So the internet comes along and they needed pictures, and the hotels said, okay, well, let me just upload them individually. And then it got to be untenable. And then the group said, wait, you have standards that we have to go through. We have to make sure that you own the rights to it. And then we got to get it in the right size and category and all this stuff. So we pivoted from producing virtual tours to distributing virtual tours to eventually collecting, managing, and distributing hotel photos. So the company was IcePortal, Internet Content Exchange. And if you travel, or basically if you go to any travel website on the planet and you look up the hotel, generally you'll see pictures. Those would have come from our servers. So it was at the right time, at the right place. And then eventually after, as you say, with SAAS, decades, we grew the company and eventually I sold it.
So were you going back to the date you gave there? Were you doing that through the .com boom and bust kind of time where some people made it, many people didn't? I think that was my first startup. I'm trying to think what year it was. I think like 99. I was working for a small startup that created some software for the liquor industry, connecting distributors and producers, and yeah, we burnt through like $1 million in a very short amount of time. The guy who ran that business. But did you kind of transition through that era? And yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I was transitioning the whole time, building. The virtual tour stuff was fairly sustainable, where I would produce virtual tours. I would give the client a CD-ROM. They would take the CD-ROM to trade shows and conferences and distribute them to promote themselves, right? Yep. So the internet starts to impede and become more interesting to a lot of the people. They were doing both. And so we would start distributing the 360 tours. And what we would do is we would say, listen, we're going to produce the tours for cheap so that we don't get competitors, right? And we'll then distribute them for you. So we had a loss leader in order to make up money later. And then eventually, the .com was a little bit less affected because we weren't that into the building of a .com site. We were the behind the scenes. We were distributing to the people that were the .com sites.
Yeah, right. Okay, makes sense. Yeah, it was for me. It was the beginning of my kind of entrepreneurial journey. I think back then. On entrepreneurship, it's interesting. Now it's everywhere, which I think is great. As in, it's almost, even with big business now, they try and encourage the kind of skill set and the thinking of entrepreneurship within big companies, and which is great. But it wasn't right back then. I mean, casting your own, of course, starting businesses has always been there, but there seemed to be this difference of, entrepreneurship was almost like it was a much rarer word, like kind of 25 years ago, right? In terms of how people threw it around. And most people hadn't, I can remember it was not something people talked about. They talked about business owners, small business starting, but the word entrepreneurship everywhere now was not necessarily back then, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I really knew what entrepreneurship was until recently, because I would just hedonistically do what I wanted to do or take advantage of things. I mean, for example, I'm in college. I'm sitting in a laundromat. I'm addicted to Pac-Man. I have a pocket full of quarters. I'm like, man, this place needs a video game, right? And so I call every laundromat in my college town of Tucson. They don't have it. I ask them if they want one, and I'll share the revenue. And a couple said yes. So that was one of my first businesses. Didn't make a lot of money, but it was one of those things where I didn't know any better. I didn't have far to fall. I mean, I wasn't going to lose my house or my mortgage or, anything else. I didn't have a family. So you just kind of do things to solve a problem that you have. That's kind of what the best of the entrepreneurship. But I think as the world progresses and information is more accessible and, there's more of a romance around entrepreneurship. And many people have this idea that I'm different, I'm special, I'm not going to be one of those statistics and fail. Of course not, right? And then, of course, while we're in the midst of it, we all have that, imposter syndrome, like, who the hell am I? Do I think that I can run a business or scale or do those things? It's not an easy task.
Yeah, indeed. Do you think entrepreneurship is a discipline that people just naturally adopt and kind of, it's a skill they naturally have, or do you think it's something that can be taught? Because now it certainly is taught. I mean, there's a million books now on, like you just said, the problem solving process of building a business, which I think is great. But I still question whether, is it an attitude that is just there inanely because of certain reasons, or?
Yeah, I think it's both, to be honest with you. I think, if you were raised with the idea that you are able to take risks and, failure is okay and you should learn by that, great. And to be honest, after I started my business and I was honest with myself, I was a total imposter. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know how to, when people would say, "Hey, you need to hire the best people," and I'm thinking, I can't even afford myself, and you want me to hire the best? I can't afford those people. But it wasn't about that, right? So understanding the structure, right? What's a vision? What's the culture mean? How do you create KPIs? All of those things were foreign to me. So I went back to school and I got my MBA in entrepreneurship in my 50s, right? In order to say, I don't know what I don't know. Let me learn how to best build a business, right? I'm not a beginning, middle, and an end like a production, but an ongoing concern, right? And how do you scale it? And so, I was relatively, I guess, optimistic in what I could do, but not very clued in. I was clueless into what I needed to do. So once I learned, and somebody handed me a book called Traction by Gino Wickman, which was like my Bible, right? And that helped me understand the basics of what needed to get done in order to try and scale the business.
Yeah, right. I don't know the book, but there is, I think everyone has their books. And certainly when I was kind of, I suppose, in my entrepreneurial phase, if you want to call it that, but I have been for a while, is business model generation, which then created all these worksheets, which were great around, which I still use all the time now, which is it's a canvas. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's very popular now with entrepreneurship, where it's a canvas where you can plot out what a business model looks like, which was a real relief because there's nothing more boring than sitting down and writing plans and trying to work things out. So anyway,
I mean, listen, I was going to say, at the end of the day, you got to solve a problem, right? You can't just say, listen, I really love clothing and I'm going to put a boutique on Main Street and everybody's going to come. What's the problem here? What are you solving? Who's got this problem, right? So if there's an opportunity, it really is, are you solving a problem or are you making life easier for something that is an issue with you, right?
Yeah.
And in the case of, the laundromat, the problem was mine. I wanted to play Pac-Man. I was sitting captive audience in a laundromat. The problem with ICE was, the internet comes along and there was no capacity to deliver photos with the reservation system. So they needed an intermediary, right? So thus the opportunity presents itself, solving a problem that existed or presented itself. Now, if I were, let's say, replicating DVDs and the internet comes along and, oh yeah, I guess I'm going to have to pivot, maybe try to store things in this new cloud thingy, right? 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of, taking advantage of a problem that you or others have, and then trying hard to be somewhat fearless and not, think, oh my God, the world's coming to an end with every hurdle and challenge, because there will be.
It's interesting what you say, like that solving a problem piece that should be so obvious, but yet again and again, you still see, and I've definitely been guilty of making this mistake working on, business models is the kind of hammer nail scenario where people create the hammer and run around looking for the nail rather than, look for the right nail or look for the right screw and create the right tool to solve the problem. It's like I see it, see it over and over again, even though it's such an obvious element to, starting and scaling.
You look at Steve Jobs and when he does his speech and says, looking back, connecting the dots connect. I mean, if you're in junior college with Steve Jobs and he's taking a course in calligraphy and you think that's the dumbest thing ever, how's that ever going to be useful in your life? Right. And it was.
Indeed.
So you never know.
Cool. So shifting topics a little bit, I know you've worked in TV series, when did that happen? When was that transition? Are you still doing it? I can't remember from the bio, but good to talk us through a bit of that and how you ended up there.
Sure. Well, at an early age, I thought, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to produce and direct movies. I want to go to Hollywood, right? And so after graduating college, I go to Los Angeles and Hollywood, and I think I'm going to produce movies, and that doesn't happen, right? But I end up on a film crew doing travel films as what's called a PA, a production assistant, which is really a gopher, right?
Yeah.
And eventually, after like 10 years of traveling around, I go from PA to sound guy to assistant director and eventually producing travel films, which then leads to another opportunity. That was my hedonistic part. Then the opportunity is one of the travel films we did was in Chile, and Chile had converted from the dictatorship of Pinochet to a democracy, and thus new television stations and a new television network were added, which meant they had a problem. They needed content. And me, this pseudo travel film producer, was going to go down and pitch this idea to the Chileans as an American producer, right? And they loved it. And so I'm producing game shows in Chile, which of course then led to learning about digital revolution and virtual tours and, the connecting the dots along the way. But back when I went to Los Angeles after college, I was introduced to a book that my father wrote, and I loved it. And so I said, Dad, I really like this. Can I buy the rights? He wasn't planning on publishing it per se, and he said, sure. So of course I had no money, so I gave him $1. And then I thought, how nepotistic of me. Dad wrote a book and I think it's good. Jeez Louise. I call a friend of mine and I ask him to read it. He's producing a movie at the time. And he says to me, I'm in the middle of something. Can you give me a little time? I'm like, yeah, I got plenty of time. 3 days later, he calls me up. I love this. Man, we have got to do this. And here we are now, 40 years later. We're just published the book. Yeah, the book, I've been holding on to it till I finish selling the tech company and I've got the bandwidth in order to do something. So I published the book as a springboard, if you will, that concept to then create a TV series that does a much deeper dive into those elements
of the book. So I just want to get the chronological order right here. So you leave college, go into TV, and that basically is what linked you to success really through the travel series, gets you into the hotel business, create the tech, years later, exit the business. Now you got time to kind of work on the passion side, project side of this book, right? Is that a rough summary of how the journey went?
That's exactly right. Going full circle and, as the pun is intended, and closing the chapter on that first dream, if you will.
Yeah, right. Cool. Well, let's talk about the book then. It looks really fascinating, the story. I was showing my wife because it just sounds like a really interesting subject matter and a little bit different. I didn't realize when I read it that it was something that had been around for years, but it was your father that wrote it. So it was published originally, or it wasn't published?
What he did was he was moving, and my sister's helping him move, and he had written this manuscript as a tribute to a friend. And my sister said, can I read it? Dad, love story, doesn't compute. He was a nonfiction travel type writer. And so what we did was we said, listen, this is great. Let me get the rights. We'll then publish it and then springboard it into a movie. Of course, life went in a different direction. That never happened. Now, obviously, 40 years ago, there were limited options. There were a handful of studios that dictated what happened with production. Now, with all of the options for streaming and content, you have a much greater opportunity to create a series for a niche audience. And the concept is fairly simple. It's a story about a guy who finds his soulmate. The only problem is she had died 100 years earlier, and then he finds her reincarnated. So the book is called The Reincarnation of Marie, and the series does a much deeper dive into that whole concept of reincarnation, or is it, are we paying for karma, or is all this an illusion, or is this, the way it should be? I mean, we find people in our current lives and we ask these questions. Did they have some involvement in a previous life? Am I paying back karma for something that I did bad, or am I getting rewarded for something I did well? Or is this all there is, right? So the series does a much deeper dive into the characters in the late 1800s. Now, this is a real woman, by the way. Marie Barstreseff is the basis of the movie or the series. And Marie was a fairly famous female artist in the late 1800s. And between 14 and 24, when she died, she wrote a journal every single day. And 2 years after her death, the journal was published and it became an international bestseller. And she would write things about, femininity and females that you didn't talk about at the time, virginity and sexuality and masturbation and stuff. I'm like, woo, you can't talk about that.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, a guy reads it 100 years later and says, oh my God, she's amazing. This woman, I love her just from her writing, right? And that's kind of the concept. He believes she was writing to him, right? And that's the basis of this love story, historical fiction.
Really interesting. I honestly think, from the small amount I know about it from what you told me, I would imagine now is going to be a much better time to be putting something like this on screen than back then. It just sounds like the subject matter. And so I'm interested. So your father, I understand there's a real element to the story. What was your father's involvement as the real element? He was writing about this, or he was part of that kind of love affair situation in real life?
Yeah, you got to get your wife to read it. She's going to love it, and you for that matter. But anyway, so the story is from his perspective. My father is the author, and he says, listen, my friend Jan, who is an army officer, came to me and he says, I have to tell you the story. I know it sounds ridiculous. I haven't told anybody. This has been going on for years, but I thought I was mad. Now I know the truth, and I'm going off to war, so somebody has to know in case something were to happen. So he writes the story on behalf of what he was told by his friend. Right. Now, I don't really know if it really was a friend telling him or if it was his own delusion that he was the one who has a quote unquote friend.
Right. Okay.
And, it was him who fell in love with this dead woman, if you will. And he's just writing the story as that. The portions that he writes and the passages that he takes from Marie's journal are impressive as hell. So if he remembered that from somebody that had told him, and according to the book, Jan had given the journal to my father, and that's where he got a lot of that information, the historical fiction part as well.
And what about the reincarnation elements? Talk us through that, because contextually, that's I don't know enough about historically about the US back then, but I imagine that's quite out of context. Here in Asia, it's not at all. It's completely culturally in context, right? But I imagine that is something quite different to be talking about in America at that point when he was writing that. Just having those thoughts when you're coming out with that narrative. Yeah, talk to us a little bit about that. It sounds interesting.
Certainly. Yeah, and the story takes place in Paris. So the story is about an American who has a friend who is on deferment, and he is a French army officer. And so he's in Paris, and he is a Frenchman. Now, it's not that he reads the book and he's the journal, if you will, of Marie, and he's convinced that he's in love with this woman, even though he knows it's this crazy idea that he can fall in love with a dead woman or a woman's writing. Yeah. And then he finds another woman that he now convinces himself is the reincarnation of Marie. She speaks the same things that Marie was thinking and had written. She wears what she used to wear. She has the same tastes in music. So he, of all of he's known or written, read what he's written in the journal, what was written in the journal, he now believes he's found her, reincarnated.
Got ya.
And that's how the reincarnation portion comes.
Interesting. So it could be just, well, you don't know. There's so much you're not sure, I suppose, just in terms of reading this. It could be just purely because of the absolute sense of conviction of this is speaking to me in the same way as these words on the page are speaking to me from this old journal. Or it could be something more metaphysical, but well, I suppose the question is, when you take this from what it was to how you plan to portray it as a TV series, which is the plan, right? So you're taking this story and what?
Correct.
Yeah. What is the kind of genre of how you see this being on screen?
Well, beyond a historical fiction, it is really a paranormal romance, and it's also a very thrilling twist and turn. So what we've done is Marie existed. Marie had a pen pal relationship with a famous writer called Guy Maupassant, and she wrote as anonymous, right? So we explore who these people are in her prior life in the 1800s, how they may affect or who they are in the current lives, right? And then we explore those soulmate connections, and we explore these concepts of karma and, love and hate being two sides of the same coin.
Cool.
And then, there's always the question, is this all sort of a figment of this guy's imagination where he's traveling in time in his mind, or is this actually something that happened or is possible? And it's not that we answer the question, but it leaves it open for, wow, what a great journey. What a lot of twists and turns. Who would have saw that coming, right?
Cool. Sounds super interesting. I would definitely, if I switched on Netflix tonight and it was there, I would watch it. So I don't know how much that tells you. But so where are you up to with it? How much is this still a dream, in terms of taking it to TV? And the other question is, are you the script writer as well, or so you've taken this, obviously a book, and you've turned it into a number of episodes for a written, you've got a script for a series, right? And is that what you've done? Right. And where are you at in the process? And yeah, right. When will I turn on Netflix and see it, I suppose, is the question.
Well, if I knew that, I'd make a lot more money as an oracle. But much like you, when I turn on Netflix and I see it there, the dream will have been, completed. But one, I did not write the script. Remember 40 years ago when I saw a guy was producing a movie, he was also a writer. He wrote the original movie, and now we've converted into a part. Yeah.
It was already written as a screenplay. Okay.
It was written as a screenplay. And when he wrote it, there were a lot of pieces to this massive puzzle laid out. And you're like, what the heck is going on? Which 40 years ago was not the way I watched movies. It was very linear. Now, as you watch things, there are bits and pieces that are laid out in the puzzle, and then you start to see clarity, and then it all comes together in the end. This is kind of what happens, right? So we came back and said, okay, this 2-hour movie is now going to be a limited series, 6-hour limited series, and possibly longer, depending on what happens. He's written the pilot with, overviews of the rest of the shows in the first season, right? So in answer to the question, where are we? We're at the fairly beginning. I mean, it's a 40-year beginning, but the book just got published. So once we get a little traction with the book, I then go to what we call showrunners, other producers, and say, listen, you've done similar type genres. Yep. I think this would be of interest. Let's work together where you start to put these pieces together because you know more than I do, the director, the cast. And once we get those elements, we create what's called a Bible. And with that, you go to the distributors and you say, listen, here are the people involved. Here's the budget. And here's the project. And the concept is obviously one that has a lot of appeal. And it's a book that has done fairly well, we're hoping, right? And then this is the catalyst. So it could be anywhere from, a year to several years, because that's the way the industry works.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's such a different industry now than it was 10 years ago as well, just because of obviously everything shifting to streaming, right? Do you intend, I mean, it sounds like you're a little bit of what before you get to that stage, but do you foresee it going through one of the kind of streaming channels as opposed to a network? I don't know a lot about the networks in the US, but okay.
I mean, listen, at the end of the day, if somebody comes along and says, look, I want to put it on a network channel, sure. But the way I see it and the way the world is going, as I mentioned, opportunistic, the reality is there are many, many, many options for streamers, and there are many niche audiences. So I think the streaming allows you a couple of things, allows you that kind of flexibility and international appeal. And it also allows you, if you do well, to go into a season 2 and beyond, right? So if this is about two soulmates passing and finding each other or not finding each other, we can go into multiple seasons where they connect and miss each other and things of that nature throughout time.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that France as well, like this covers a few geographies, right, in terms of the story, so which can be very helpful in terms of just the financing, but also just the appeal, the audience appeal, right, today when you're covering a few geographies.
And what we did, the book was written in France in the 50s. We updated a little bit for the psychedelic 70s, and now it's an army officer or an officer from the U.S. who is going to Vietnam. So
Okay.
we changed a little bit to make it more U.S. centric and a little more flower power. And there's great music and stuff of the time that can be incorporated as well.
Cool. Awesome. Well, it sounds super interesting. I'm, really, good to dig into a bit of it. I didn't really have any more questions. I think, first time we chatted, I know we covered a few different bases, and I'm sure, with your background, we probably could do a whole podcast on one area, but, nice to kind of just hear the journey and in particular, this project. Is there anything I didn't ask you wanted to share, or otherwise, where can people find out more and get in touch and watch the... Yeah, hopefully watch
absolutely. I think the other thing that wasn't asked that I don't have an answer for is what's the meaning of life, but no, nobody really knows. The answer is where can people find me or more? We created a website called mariethestory.com, and that includes information on the book. That's The Reincarnation of Marie. That includes information on my father, the author. That includes information on it's the TV series, which now has a working title of Slippin', which is like slipping through time. And then some links, obviously, to, LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that. So everything's at mariethestory.com.
Awesome. Well, I'll include that in the notes for anyone watching, listening. But Henry, good to meet, good to jump on and enjoy the rest of your day.
Likewise.
And let's chat again sometime. So.
Be free to do what we want to
Two
do.
are Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barker, the president of Hell's Angels.
This is 1095.